Welcome to our latest Hippocratic Adventures chat. I'm Dr. Shwani Bapat, and today I am so excited to have Dr. Carmen Brown back with us. Dr. Carmen Brown is an OBGYN, author, blogger, founder, mother. She's board certified in Australia, in New Zealand, and the US, and has written ExpatMD, a book that really helps American physicians who want to live and work in Australia or New Zealand. She now lives in Melbourne, Australia with her husband and young son. And she's also previously been on our show and written several blogs sharing what it's been like to move to New Zealand and then to Australia. And of course, I'm going to include links to all of this good stuff below. But before we get started, make sure to hit subscribe and then sit back and enjoy. So today we're going to explore one doctor's experience of being a Black physician in the US, and also what that experience has been like in New Zealand and in Australia. And look, we already know that institutionalized racism is so widespread in the US. It's been identified in study after study in so many different contexts. But I guess the question I have is it different anywhere else? Let's find out. Dr. Carmen Brown, thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you so much. It's so good to be here with you again. It's been a long time. So thanks for having me back.
So let's get to it. What is it like being a Black physician in the US, and how does that compare to what it's like now in Australia? Because that's where you are currently living.
Yes. So the interesting thing about my experience in the United States is I'm a Southern girl. So born and raised in Atlanta, and I've done most of my training in the Southern United States. So I think that the South gets this like negative connotation as far as being where you don't want to be. But I have to admit, as far as being a Black physician in the United States, I think that's one of those things that always kind of sticks with you, that it's always, you are a bit different. Of course, we've all heard stories about being mistaken for, orderly or housekeeping or those types of things. And that has all happened to me. So all those things that we associate with microaggressions have happened to me in the United States. So I feel that, of course, in different parts of the United States, you might have either very major aggressions or minor aggressions. I remember being an intern in Alabama, and I had a patient one night when I walked in the room to assess her for her labor. I was told by her husband that they did not want a Negro doctor. Wow. So that's what I was told. And this is not in like, the 1800s, because I'm not that old, but I'm old. But so this actually happened. And it was actually in a weird way, as far as being a Black American in the United States, you kind of are used to some of these types of micro and macro aggressions. And so at that moment, it didn't hurt me per se, but it was actually more of a like hee, because I was like, wow, they don't even know that my chief resident on tonight is also a Black female. So, I skipped out of the room to go get her and tell her that, hey, they want another doctor. It just happened to be just us that night. So I've definitely had those issues that have happened in the United States. But I think the United States and the way we think about things is we think about it as such a microcosm that we think that everywhere in the world is like that. But we have a very unique history. We have a very unique way of how we have race relations. And it's not like that everywhere. And that's where the difference is. So in the United States, yes, I had that happen. But when I got to Australia or New Zealand, I was literally treated as like the person that walked in the room. There was no preconceived notion that, hey, she's Black, or this person is considered, like less than, or has this history in the United States of being this particular way. There was none of that preconceived notion. So I was just treated as the clinician that was coming in to take care of them. And that is what is so unique, I think, about being in particular countries that don't have that same history as the United States, is that it was really refreshing to just be taken at literally face value, but it's face value as the clinician that was coming in to take care of them.
And so what was that experience like then when you walk into a room and they see you as the physician that you are? Because that must
Oh my
be, yeah, tell me.
God. It's so like refreshing. Oh my gosh. Like I try to tell my friends and family back home what it's like. But it's like this beautiful, refreshing feeling like people actually judge you by your character and the content and not just by what they see. And it's just so amazing. Like you come in, you introduce yourself, and you're like, well, I'm the consultant or the, attending doctor or the person in charge of your care. And the person is just like, well, thank you, welcome. And it's just that they just go on from there. And it's just such an amazing feeling to not have to like prove that, I'm a really good doctor, I graduated from a great residency program, not to have to give your credentials to prove to them, that you are qualified enough to take care of them. It's just a refreshing way of starting off on a normal footing. So it's really been nice, and I've been very jaded having that for the last 10 years, but I've enjoyed it. Definitely enjoyed it.
Yeah, because it almost sounds like all that energy that probably in the US you had put into like proving yourself over and over again. Now you don't have to spend your energy in that way, and you can actually
No,
spend it in different ways.
I don't. I used to remember, I used to recite my resume when I went in
Mhm.
to see people, to try to prove to them that I was worthy and I had trained hard enough and done the best things to prove that I'm that kind of obstetrician gynecologist. And I don't feel that I have to do that. I don't carry my resume with me anymore. I don't have to explain to people where I've been, what I've done, how many patients I've taken care of. So yeah, it's been a very refreshing change.
Yeah, that sounds like, first of all, that's exhausting to have to do every time you step into a room. And it's nice to actually not have to do that, and that you can just do your job of being an obstetrician and gynecologist.
Yes, yes.
What do you, and that, so that's in Australia. Is that similar? Is that culture similar in New Zealand as well?
Yes. I think that New Zealand was very unique in that it's a little bit different from Australia in that because it's such a small country.
Mhm.
And so remember, New Zealand has 4 million people, like four and a
Wow.
half million people.
What?
That's
That's
it. So that's
nothing.
like Phoenix, Arizona. That's that's like some of our major cities.
Yeah.
So the whole country has that many people.
Wow.
And what I thought was so interesting and unique about it is for a lot of the people, it literally could have been their very first time ever talking to an American.
Wow.
And then on top of that, talking to a Black American. And so, my husband and I had a little cute way of saying it's almost like, they saw a unicorn or something like that. Cause a lot of times I would walk into the room and the patient's eyes would light up and they would be like, oh, because they've seen things on TV,
Mm.
they've watched movies and things like that. But this is their very first time having any interaction with a American, but on top of that, a Black American. And so
Mm.
it's so interesting because they would forget the care part and that I'm supposed to be taking care of them, but they would be asking me all kinds of questions about, America and where you're from and those kind of things. So I still had the great experience in New Zealand. I definitely didn't feel the same type of issue that I felt maybe in the United States. But I thought that New Zealand was very interesting in that I think because it's such a small place, that the people were really more like, wow, we actually have someone like you here. And it was really, it's kind of nice. So I felt like almost like a little mini superstar. My husband and I, everyone in town knew us, everyone in town knew us. So that was kind of fun. I really enjoyed that. And I felt very comfortable. And even in that area where, we were literally the only ones, but it was a
Wow.
comforting feeling, not something that you were ostracized.
Yeah, that's so interesting because when I think about, I grew up in the Northeast in New Jersey, and I very distinctly remember, I think it was in third or fourth grade, my family did a road trip down to North Carolina because we had a family friend there, and we were like, while we're here, let's go see the Great Smoky Mountains. And I remember that road trip so well because I remember the moment we went south of Washington, D.C. I was in like third or fourth grade in the 90s. And the moment we went south of Washington, D.C., I saw Confederate flags everywhere, like on cars, on the bumpers of cars, in front of schools, on people's, like in people's backyards, like in their front yards, actually. And I remember in that moment being like, oh my God, I'm not welcome here. And
Huh?
how can people who are not white see this every day and live here?
Yes.
And that was me, I was
Yes.
young. I was in third grade. I didn't understand much beyond that. But it actually took me till well into my 30s to then go back to the South. At some point, we did like a girls' trip to Nashville. And it took a lot for them to convince me to go into a state like Tennessee, to go to even Nashville just to visit, because that experience as a third grader was just so profound. And we never, like my family never actually went back south again.
Yeah.
And
Yep.
so, you mentioned earlier that when people think about the South who aren't from the South, they see it as this place that's, I don't know, it was scary for me. So I do
Yeah.
wonder, like, what was that like? You grew up in Atlanta?
I did. Interesting enough, so Atlanta is like this little tiny microcosm within the South. So the history of Atlanta is quite unique. It's like the birthplace of the civil rights movement. So
Mm,
there in Birmingham is where you see a lot of the greatest civil rights leaders coming out of. So growing up, I knew exactly where, Martin Luther King's church was, and where we have some of the greatest civil rights leaders, Julian Bond, Andrew Young, those types of things. So those are like normal people in
yeah.
our lives. And so growing up in Atlanta, you were very sheltered
Mm,
from the external type of things that were all around you in Georgia and Alabama. But I knew growing up as a child, it was instilled very early into me that you do not go north of Atlanta
mm,
after sundown. That is a no-no. I remember very, 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 very well. My mother liked to go to these outlet shops that were north of Atlanta, a couple of hours north of Atlanta in the North Georgia mountains. And this was in like the late 70s, 80s when I was younger. And we went to an outlet and we were checking out. And the lady at the register was very, very nice. But she told my mother very nicely, she said, you and your beautiful little girls should be out of town before sundown
wow.
because you're not supposed to be here. And I remember my mom hearing that, and my mom, like, that look on her face, like, okay, let's get our stuff and go. And then in my mind as a child, I was like, why can't we be here? Like, I don't
Mm,
get it. But like, it took a lot later to understand that that was like a sundown town. Like, those are the places that as a Black person, you were not welcome after, hours, and that theoretically something could happen to you. And so I think growing up in Atlanta, I was very sheltered from that. But as I got older and ventured out, going to do, residency in Alabama and Texas, and, going to university in Louisiana and driving back, there's certain rules that we had to abide by. My mother's number one rule driving back and forth from university in, New Orleans was do not do that at night. You cannot go
mm,
through Alabama or Mississippi at night. And this was not in the early 1960s or 70s. I'm not that old, but this is like in the 1990s, and
mm,
things like that are still perpetuated and are still very, very fresh in the minds of our parents who grew up in the 60s and the 70s and that type of thing, and lived through the civil rights movement. Unfortunately, our country is still very fragmented, and there are still places that you are not welcome. And we are taught that as children, and that still is perpetuated down, through generations. And so, the fact that I'm, not that old, but still carry those memories and knowing that, and the fact that you know that, and you had
mm.
those memories of North Carolina, we have a lot of work to do. We really have a lot of work to do.
Yeah. And so how has it been now you're raising your son in Australia? Um, how how does that conversation go? Or, what is that like now?
So that's a very interesting question. So I really think that I would probably defer that to some of my friends. I have a lot of friends that are Americans here. I think our situation is a little bit unique in that because my son is special needs, our conversations are a little bit different. And I think there's a little bit of a not understanding of certain nuances, like, race and those types of things. But I do have a lot of Black American friends that are here with me in Australia, and they have had those conversations. Um, I know that my son is very interesting in that we moved here when he was 9 months old. So I've had people ask him where he's from, and he totally tells them with a straight face, "I'm from New Zealand," and I'm like, "No, he's not." And so because that's his formative memories, we moved
Mm,
from New Zealand when he was almost 4 years old. So in his mind, that's where he's from because he doesn't remember anything before then. So I think that for my friends and what I've heard them explain to them is that, you know, we carry a privilege here in Australia or in New Zealand that's very different from what our cousins or other family members might have in the United States, in that the very first thing we're judged by is just literally your character and your content. And
mm,
it's exactly what the whole dream was about, that that's what it should be, and
mm,
not necessarily by the color of your skin. It seems like a very novel thing, but that's what it is here. And it's not that we don't have our own issues with racism in Australia or New Zealand, because I'm not trying to paint this beautiful picture that there's zero racism here. There is definitely racism, but I think the issue is that when dealing with Black Americans, we come from a particular privilege because you're considered American first
mm,
above all else. And that kind of changes things significantly when you're a Black American over here. And it's a very interesting and sometimes very awkward space to be in, because you're not treated the same as, say, for instance, like an Aboriginal woman or
mm.
a woman, that's African, like directly from the continent. So I think it carries a little bit of a privilege that sometimes puts us in a very uncomfortable space on how to navigate that. But that's where we find ourselves, and that's exactly what happens when we're here.
Wow, that is different. And do you feel like, I mean, from your experience, look, you're not a historian, I get that, but from your personal experience, what do you think kind of like accounts for this difference? Is it the history? Like, I mean, I can just list all the reasons why in the US, but did New Zealand and Australia, like, did they not have a similar history with slavery or?
Exactly. That
Mm,
I think it comes down to exactly that. There was not a 400-year history of
mm,
slavery here, with Africans, and so their difference as far as their experience with people of color, that kind of thing, is completely and utterly different. And so we don't have that long 400-500-year history of slavery, Jim Crow, those types of things.
mm,
And so it's kind of like starting off with a clean slate as far as Black Americans are concerned. So I definitely, you're right. I think because most Australians and New Zealanders don't have a preconceived notion of, Black Americans and how they're expecting certain actions, and how we're supposed to talk or speak or do or things like that. It's literally, you're being judged on the fact that here's a new person in front of me, what's their character like, what are they like, what do they do, that type of thing. And so um it's a really beautiful kind of position to be in. I remember an experience that we had when we were in New Zealand. We got into a car accident,
mm,
and thankfully no one was hurt, but the police came, and they said they had to sort of ticket out and everything. And so the police officer said he would come by the house later to drop off the citation. And that's a very New Zealand thing, very kind, very polite, that kind of thing. But the gentleman came by later, the policeman came by later, and he saw, I had a like 4-year-old little boy, and he's like, does he want to ride in the police car and he can play with the siren? And we're like, no, because in our minds, all we kept thinking is Black American, we don't want our little boy in the police car. And, we're
mm,
we're still in that context, and that stressful kind of area. But in his mind, he was just like, there's a little kid here. Does he want to play in the police car?
Mhm.
And it's just really sad that we still had that very traumatic experience as far as, police officers and, how those interactions are. And here we had this beautiful policeman that just literally wanted to have a little child have this amazing experience with playing with a police siren. So we're actually trying to learn how to change our behaviors, but also we have these people here that don't have these preconceived notions of how we're supposed to be or how we may be or those types of things. So it's a really nice fresh way of starting off with relationships.
I think that's incredible, and I think uh, I can only imagine, just what I keep hearing from your stories is almost relief that you can show up, that you can that because they don't have that history, they can just not come in with like hundreds of biases that have informed them since childhood of what you
Yes.
are like and who you're like and what you should behave like, and that they kind of can see you and interact with you in a way that is a little bit out of curiosity too, right? Being like, who's
Yes.
this American lady
Yes.
that showed up here? And I think when
Yes.
it comes from a place of curiosity, it's so different than when it comes from like a place of all these biases,
Distrust.
distrust.
Hmm.
Yes.
Yes.
I think that's
Yes.
incredible and refreshing. And it sounds like um, it just sounds healthier, like just
It
mental
is.
health, like all the things you don't have to necessarily carry every time you
It
go out.
is. It is. I totally agree. I know there's been a lot of studies about epigenetics, and we look at like Black maternal morbidity and mortality in the United States. And we talk about epigenetics and how, like, generations and generations of stress and trauma have shaped our genetics and predisposed us to certain types of poor outcomes. And I know it's too late for me, but I just wonder if there is a way to possibly even reprogram that, for like my son and future generations, in that taking them out of like a very toxic situation and where you're always having to have those difficult conversations and see very horrible toxic things on the internet, on the news and that type of thing. It just makes me wonder like how it could be, and it's in a way refreshing, but it's also very sad because I
Mm.
have nieces and nephews and friends and family back in the United States, back home, and it's just like knowing that my day to day does not at all resemble what they go through. It's just, in some ways, it's really nice to not have to deal with it, but I also am still very cognizant of the fact that they still have to deal with that.
Yeah, I think that's 100% true. Well, Dr. Carmen Brown, thank you so much for joining us and for sharing your stories and being so open and honest about what it has been like for you and for your family. I think I'm so glad that we're having these conversations, and um, I think it's a really great way to understand. Um, I think for a lot of people that the way that we exist in the US is not the only way to be. And I hope that this like opens people's eyes up to other possibilities and other ways to interact on a more human and person to person way.
I totally agree. And thank you so much for giving me this opportunity. And you were so right. I hope it, has, other listeners or people that are looking at the blogs and podcasts, just to think about, if they are, a minority American, that they can actually exist somewhere outside the United States and very possibly have a much better lifestyle than they had in the United States. Not saying there's anything horribly wrong with staying in the United States, but I just want to open their minds to some other opportunities. So thank you so much for allowing me to kind of talk about our experiences.
Now, I'd love to hear from you. What's your biggest insight or aha from this conversation? What resonated with you the most? Let me know in the comments below. And if you're looking to start your own adventure, then you're going to love our free ebook, How to Start Your Adventure. You can head over to hippocraticadventures.com/subscribe right now, where you'll learn the 3 steps to get going. And if you loved this conversation, make sure to hit like and subscribe. It really helps us bring more of these conversations to our physician community. And with that, we wrap up another episode of Discovering Where Your White Coat Can Take You. Thank you so much for listening, and I'll see you in the next video.